Type 2 diabetes is a disease that causes increased fatigue, blurred vision, and is associated with obesity and elevated cholesterol. Type 2 diabetes is usually acquired as an adult, resulting from a sedentary lifestyle and poor diet. Thus, the goal of this animation is to give you a little bit of motivation to get out there and exercise. And the animation is going to do this by showing you exactly what happens at the molecular level that causes type 2 diabetes and how exercise prevents this from happening. So this animation is going to be divided into two sections. The first section is going to be the foundation section. The first part of the foundation section is going to be conceptual based, where we take a look at how the body communicates with each other. In the second part of the first section, we are going to learn some facts, specifically the roles and the names of the molecules involved in diabetes. Then, in the second section, we are going to take the foundation that we learned from the first section and use that to understand how exercise prevents diabetes. When your body undergoes an environmental change, such as an injury or becoming cold, it needs a way to orchestrate a response to that change. Your body does this by sending out messages to its cells. These messages order cells usually to perform some kind of relevant action in regards to that environmental change. There are multiple organs within the body that are responsible for sending out these messages. These organs make up what we call the endocrine system. So whenever I mention the phrase endocrine system, just think the place where a message originates from. Also, don't worry about learning the names of all these organs. They're not really important for this animation. The only organ that is important for this animation is the pancreas, because it is associated with type 2 diabetes. So let's look at an example of how your body uses messages to communicate environmental changes. Let's say you have a huge gash on your face. If this happens, your brain will send the message, repair, to the cells around the injury. When the message reaches the cells, it will compel the cells to rebuild the damaged tissue, and voila, no more face gash. Or suppose you're stranded out in the frozen tundra of Russia. As your body begins to feel cold, your adrenal gland will send out the message, shiver, to the entire body. Shivering is an evolutionary conserved process that our body uses to try to heat itself up. The term used to describe the transfer of a message from the endocrine system to a cell is called a signaling pathway. As you can imagine, there are thousands of signaling pathways sending thousands of messages. If all these messages were all being continuously sent to a cell, then the cell would become very overwhelmed. Sending the message shiver to cells near a wounded area would not be beneficial at all. And unless you are in danger, the adrenaline message would not do much good either. To prevent message overload, your body only allows signaling pathways carrying relevant messages to go to your cells. Your body regulates message overload by keeping all signaling pathways in an off position and only turns the pathway on when the message is needed. For example, when your body experiences an injury, it'll turn on the pathway that carries the message repair. On the other hand, if your body is cold, then it'll turn on the shiver pathway. Finally, if your life is in danger, then your body will most likely turn on the adrenaline pathway. Keeping each signaling pathway in an off position and selectively turning on appropriate pathways prevents the cell from being counterproductive. But what exactly is carrying the message to the cell? How messages are transported in the body is a lot like the game telephone. At some point in your life you probably played this game where the objective is to successfully transfer a message through a line of people. Imagine we have 4 people playing the game telephone. Their names are Abby, Brian, Cho, and Dan. Abby wants to relay the message, "Meet tomorrow at Gutman," to Dan. But she cannot directly send the message to Dan and instead must go through Brian and Cho. So Abby will first pass the message to Brian. You'll notice that once Abby does this, his color changes to green. This symbolizes that he has successfully received the message. Then, once Brian has received the message, he will pass it to Cho, who will then pass it on to Dan. In the signaling pathway, we see the same type of message system. Instead of humans, however, the body uses proteins to transfer the message. Proteins come in lots of different shapes and sizes, and as we'll see later on, their shape and size is a reflection of what kind of role they serve in the signaling pathway. So, just to reiterate, proteins are analogous to the people playing the game telephone, as they are the messengers responsible for relaying messages to the cell. So, let's now look at an example of how this works within the body. In this signaling pathway, the pancreas is releasing proteins into the bloodstream. The protein will use the bloodstream as a highway to travel to the cell. Once the protein has arrived at the cell, it will interact with the protein that is attached to the outer membrane of the cell. This will turn on the second protein. Just like in the game telephone and in previous examples, when a protein turns green, that means that it has been successfully turned on. The turning on of a protein is analogous to when a message has been successfully transferred between 2 people playing the game telephone. Once the second protein has been turned on, it is going to turn on the third protein. When the third protein has been turned on, it will then turn on the fourth protein. When the fourth protein has been turned on, it is going to turn on the fifth and final protein in the signaling pathway. Once this protein is turned on, it will enter the nucleus. The nucleus is the area of the cell that is capable of interpreting the message and implementing the requested change. Remember how each signaling pathway carries a message? Well, in the insulin signaling pathway, the message is "make energy." Because we need energy to virtually do anything, this is one of the most important signaling pathways. Because the insulin pathway is involved in making energy, it is activated when you eat food. When there is food in your stomach, this tells your cells that there are nutrients available to be used as resources for making energy. Once your cells receive the message to make energy, they will begin to make energy that can either be used immediately or that can be stored in the form of fat so that it can be used at a later time. Now, we're finally ready to look at the insulin signaling pathway. Well, actually, we're already a step ahead. The last pathway we looked at was the insulin signaling pathway, but all the names were omitted so that we could focus more on the concept of signaling pathways. This time through the insulin signaling pathway, we are going to learn the names of the proteins and the role each protein plays. The insulin signaling pathway is named after the first protein in its pathway, insulin. When your body intakes food, the pancreas releases insulin into the bloodstream. Insulin is a hormone that relays the message, "make energy," from the pancreas to your cells. The insulin receptor, or just IR, acts like a lighthouse guiding a boat into its dock, by guiding insulin towards the cell. The IR's responsibility is to reel in insulin towards the cell. Proteins like IR serve an important role as they mark cells. What I mean by that is that if a cell has an IR, then it says to insulin, "Hey, I'm a cell that's really good at making energy." In other words, only cells that have a capacity to make energy will have insulin receptors. And what if a cell does not have an IR? Then insulin will simply pass by the cell and not interact with it. Once the IR is turned on, it will then turn on the third protein in the pathway, IRS. Proteins like IRS are called adapter proteins, as they, unlike the IR and insulin, are able to turn on proteins within the cell. When IRS is turned on, It will then turn on the fourth protein in the pathway, PI3K. Proteins like PI3K are called kinases. That's kinases, and are excellent at maneuvering within the cell. PI3K travels to the center of the cell where the nucleus is located and turns on the fifth and final protein in the pathway, FOXO. FOXO is called a transcription factor. That's transcription factor. Transcription factors like FOXO have the ability to transport messages into the nucleus. Entrance into the nucleus is highly exclusive and is limited to only a few proteins within the cell because the nucleus protects the cell's most valuable asset, DNA. Therefore, it is important to have proteins like FOXO at the end of signaling pathways because they have access to the nucleus. Once FOXO enters the nucleus, it will interact with the cell's DNA, causing the cell to take the appropriate course of action for creating energy. Now that we understand how the insulin signaling pathway works, we can see what causes type 2 diabetes. It is possible for a break in the signaling pathway to occur. Referring back to the telephone game, suppose that Brian suddenly becomes deaf. If this happens, it is impossible for Abby to whisper the message to Brian, because Brian will not be able to hear Abby. The signaling pathway is broken as Brian never receives the message and is therefore unable to continue to pass the message to Cho, who cannot deliver the message to Dan. Consequently, a break in communication between Brian and Abby causes all participants downstream of Brian to never receive the message. In type 2 diabetes, a break similar to the one between Abby and Brian occurs between insulin and the IR. The IR becomes deaf, making it unable to receive the message from insulin. That is, insulin is trying to turn on the IR, but the IR has lost its ability to turn on. Because the IR cannot receive the message, the signaling pathway is severed. The IR is never turned on, and as a consequence, IRS is never turned on. Because IRS is never turned on, PI3K will never be turned on. And in the same fashion, because PI3K is never turned on, FOXO will not be turned on, causing the message to never reach the nucleus. This break in communication occurs in a high frequency in the cells of diabetics. Without the message "make energy" reaching the cell, the body's ability to make energy plummets. This is why diabetics typically experience chronic fatigue. Also, because your cells are not making energy, as a safety measure, your body responds by lowering your metabolism, making it very difficult for diabetics to lose weight. Conversely, exercising enhances the IR's ability to become turned on, making it easier for the body to communicate to its cells to make energy. Since exercise